Sorry, my computer just seems to be having a mind of its own. Okay, so let me just quickly admit the two people who have joined us and say welcome and thank you for being here. I'm Angela Campbell, and I am the Associate Provost of Equity and Academic Policies, and I'm here with Bonnie Borenstein, who is the Regulatory Advisor in the Secretariat. And we are here talking today about the processes related to tenure, focusing specifically on DTCs and UTCs. I think most people here today are members of DTCs, if I'm not mistaken. This is really meant to be an interactive discussion. So while I'm sharing my screen, I'm not gonna be able to see people raising their hand, but unless you raise your virtual hand, I'll get a notification. So please feel free. We're not such a large group that it becomes a problem if you just speak out while I'm speaking. That's not a problem at all. I don't mind that. I'm just going to actually, oops, I'm sorry. I'm going to get started and share the context for our work. I'm also going to minimize this and start by just indicating that the regulations in question that we should be looking at are the regulations relating to the employment of tenure track and tenured academic staff, which set out in full the processes related to tenure at Section 7. And that includes the processes that both the DTCs and the UTCs follow. And then for librarians, and I don't know if colleagues from libraries are here, but for librarians, the process is set out in the regulations relating to the employment of librarian staff, and their colleagues who are assessing librarians who are applying for tenure should be looking at Section 3. And the website where you can find these regulations is at the hyperlink set out here. So in terms of the timing of tenure consideration, I think most people who are here today know that most colleagues will go up for tenure when they are, excuse me, sorry, when I'm getting these notifications. Just give me 1 second, I'm gonna stop sharing. Sorry, Bonnie, can you keep an eye on the waiting room and I'll focus on this. I'm also gonna stop sharing my video. Okay. Let me return here. Okay, here we were. So most people who are going up for tenure will go up in their 6th year as assistant professors. We do have some situations though when individuals have been hired at the rank of associate professor or associate librarian. And in those cases, if they came in without tenure, the mandatory year of tenure consideration for them is the 5th year of their appointment. And then for full professors, we haven't had a case in as long as I know of a full professor appointed without tenure. So the regs cover this, but it's not really an issue in practicality. It is possible for professors or for librarians to go up from their 3rd year of tenure consideration. So anyone who's in their 3rd year, or after rather their 3rd year, is entitled to go up on their own. So you may have, for example, if you're a departmental chair who's here, you may have a request from a candidate who is in pre-tenure and wants to go up for tenure consideration early before their mandatory year. They may talk to you about that, and they're entitled to go of their own volition anytime after their 3rd year at McGill. And the chair, however, can initiate the process in any year with the candidate's consent. And normally early consideration happens. Well, I wouldn't say normally. We have some very, very ambitious, productive colleagues who will go up early, but in many cases where a colleague wants to go up early, it's because they have had time at a prior institution before coming to McGill as a tenure track position or the equivalent thereof. An associate or full professors can go up for tenure at any time, so they don't have to seek the chair's permission. They can submit their dossier whenever they think they're ready. So you all know, I believe, that there are 3 levels of review. The DTC or LTC, which is the Departmental or Library Tenure Committee, and it's chaired by the department chair in most cases, as well as 4 other members. The UTC, or the University Tenure Committee, which is chaired by the dean, plus 5 other members, 2 of whom will be members of the same faculty as the tenure candidate, and then the principal or her delegate, and in all cases, the principal delegates her authority on tenure to the provost. So he will have the final review. And there are some cases where colleagues have joint appointments, and then those cases, the DTC and sometimes also the UTC will have to have representation from the different units where the colleague is appointed. And in those cases, we can assist you with how to construct the committee fairly and appropriately, but it's also set out in the regulations. One thing that I really do want to stress is that each level of review is a review on the merits of the dossier. So for example, if you're a UTC member, the DTC report will be considered in your review, but you should be conducting your own review of the file based principally on the tenure portfolio. So the DTC will have some weight, but it shouldn't be steering or directing outcomes one way or the other. And the same thing is true for the principal or her delegate when the file reaches that level. Okay, delayed consideration is important. I want to spend a little bit of extra time here, more so than I normally would, just because of what has occurred this year in relation to the impact of COVID. So as usual, any faculty member who had an authorized leave away from the university for longer than 3 months is allowed to elect to defer their tenure consideration. And the result of making that election is that you get placed into the subsequent year's tenure cohort. So someone, for example, who had a parental leave of 6 months or 9 months, let's say, 3 years ago and was up for tenure this year had the right to choose to go up for tenure this year or next year, right? So they could go up for tenure in 2021. And in order to do that, they would have had to communicate to their chair that they made this election, and then the chair would in turn communicate to the dean, academic personnel office, and secretariat. So we know that the candidate is not going up for tenure this year, the ordinary year of tenure consideration, but instead they've elected to defer by a year and be put in next year's tenure cohort. So that's usual, that's normal. We've seen that year after year. And I know some people on this call are seasoned DTC members or chairs, and so you'll have seen this. This year, as you know, the university, as did most other universities across North America, with the onset of COVID very early on, decided to allow colleagues, any colleague, to elect to defer their tenure consideration by 1 year on account of COVID. So colleagues can make this choice, and they have to make the choice by the same timing as for any other situation of deferral. That is by June 1st of the year of tenure consideration. And they should be signaling that to the chair. They don't have to give reasons. They don't have to demonstrate how COVID impacted their work or their productivity or their family life or anything. They can just choose. And so if they have made that choice, then they again would be put into the subsequent year's consideration for tenure. And this applies also to reappointment, just so you know. So I've already indicated that if a person makes the election to defer, then that has to be communicated by June 1st of the year of tenure consideration. So suppose that a colleague is going up for tenure or is supposed to go up for tenure next September 1st, and they want to defer by a year on account of a leave or on account of COVID, they have to signal that. That has to be signaled to the provost's office no later than June 1st of 2021. So there has to be some notice given so that everybody knows that the colleague's being pushed into the next year's tenure cohort. It's possible to defer. Normally we would say up to 2 times, but we're also allowing people now who have the COVID extension to defer for an additional year. So colleagues may have as many as 3 years of time toward tenure consideration, additional to what they normally would have. What I want to put to you though is that people should not be encouraged to be taking deferrals one way or the other. Okay, so we really want to encourage colleagues who are pre-tenured to make an informed choice. But if as a chair you see someone who's been doing extremely well, for example, through the merit process year after year, and they say to you as a chair, I'm going to defer because of COVID, I think it's a really good idea to have a conversation with that colleague and ask them why. Like, is it really the case that they're at risk of not getting tenure? Of course, we don't want them to put them in harm's way, but there is a cost to deferring tenure consideration, and 3 years is a long time to defer. And I would say that most of the time, the deferrals that are being elected are being elected by women. So this has an impact on time and through career progression and also on salary. So it is an issue that I did want to flag. It requires some level of discretion and judicious exercise of discretion. And the colleagues have that right, and they should be counseled to take that right or to make that election if it really is the case that they need that extra year. Otherwise, their tenure really will hang in the balance. But if you've got someone who's done super well year after year and their file is strong, then it is possible to counsel them to say, look, think about it, because in fact, you have a really strong file. And colleagues who hear that may want to think through things through more carefully. But of course, it always is the candidate's decision, and they have to be left to make that decision based on what they're most comfortable with. Are there any questions on that? I'll just give it a moment.
Don Leiden has a question in chat.
Okay, please, can you read it, Bonnie? Just can't see it.
Sorry. John, would you like to speak it out?
Sure. So Angela, I'm wondering if someone defers going up for tenure, is there a ripple effect on their reappointment period? Do we have to add another year to their reappointment somehow?
Oh, do you mean the other way around? Like if they defer going up for reappointment, but not tenure?
Well, no. So it's their 6th year and they decide, oh, because of COVID, I'm going to wait another year.
Yep.
Do we have to do anything else on the reappointment side to give them a 1-year extension?
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, that happens automatically. We do it on our side. So when we get that request, we extend their contract by a year.
Oh, nice. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Any other questions? Okay. I'll keep going. All right. So the basis of tenure in regard to professors is premised on teaching, research, and service, as you know. Librarians is a little bit different. Position responsibilities, professional and scholarly activities, and other contributions. One thing to stress is that the minimum assessment is superior performance in any 2 of the categories and reasonable in the 3rd. And so sometimes particularly junior professors, there are urban legends related to the fact that people think they need the superior in research to get to tenure, and that's not true. We have had some cases where research has been reasonable and individuals have been tenured with that record of performance. It is very common to see junior professors at McGill achieve superior across the board in all 3 areas of responsibility. For librarians, one of the superiors has to be in position responsibilities. So I think people who are here on the LTC know that, but librarians are a little bit different because there is a singled out category of academic duty where that's the superior, at least one of the superiors has to be in that area, particularly position responsibilities. Anyone who gets a less than reasonable, so each dossier in the tenure file, teaching, research, and service, is assessed on its own individual merits, and each individual dossier is given a rating of either superior, reasonable, or less than reasonable. And if any of those dossiers is accorded a less than reasonable by the committee, in those cases, tenure cannot be recommended. So a less than reasonable on any of these areas of responsibility will lead to a negative recommendation in regard to tenure. With respect to what is assessed, so we look at performance, like what actually has been done in the job, not promise. So for example, if colleagues have material in the pipeline or exciting projects on the horizon, that can be given some weight, but it really can't be decisive. It has to be what has been done, what is already output. And that means that things like publications that are in press are valued, of course, and important. Things that are under review can be helpful, but they're going to be obviously given much less weight than things that have already been accepted and are on their way to becoming ready for public consumption. The period of time that gets assessed is all years up to the tenure track, or sorry, to the period of tenure consideration at McGill. So we look at all the time spent in the tenure track at McGill. And for example, things that have been accomplished prior to the appointment in the tenure track. So let's say, for example, someone joined McGill when they were a CAS research, a contract academic staff researcher, and then had a tenure track appointment. The research grants and productivity that happened during the time that the person was a CAS researcher typically wouldn't be able to be counted for the purposes of the tenure file. The exception, I say typically because the exception is cases where a person goes up for early tenure. So a person who goes up early prior to their year of mandatory consideration, they're allowed to count back to the time prior to their appointment at McGill, and they're allowed to go back 5 years. And it's 5 years because typically the mandatory time to tenure consideration is a 5-year period. So if a person goes up, let's say 2 years early, then they can count 2 years of performance prior to their appointment at McGill. Tenure applicants will set out their file in the way that they see most fit. So they can include elements in their teaching that they think are teaching and research that they think are research. Some things are obviously going to go into teaching or research or service. For example, undergrad teaching is teaching, but things, for example, like graduate supervision, some people will put that in teaching and some people in research. And so that's fine. People can choose where to put things. They shouldn't be listing things in more than one place, in more than one aspect of the file, unless there are, for example, elements of work that were different. So for example, let's say a person organized a major research conference or congress, that will probably count as service. But at the same time, there may be elements in that work that had a huge or important research impact. So the person may want to describe the activity in 2 places, but where that's done, colleagues should really be justifying that decision. So if you're on a DTC and you see that, please look for that. The files you'll see include the following elements. So the CV of the person, a personal statement outlining the candidate's performance of academic duties, the record of teaching, the record of research, the record of general contributions to the university and scholarly communities or service, other materials the candidate may wish to submit. And here, this is really on the candidate to ensure that the dossier is complete and cogent. If as a DTC or a UTC, you feel that material is missing or not well explained, you do have the right to ask for clarifying information. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But it can happen that you're looking through a file and something seems ambiguous or unclear, or there's a gap, and you can ask for information to fill those gaps. And it doesn't necessarily require a meeting. You can ask for that information through written correspondence. After September 1st, so around this period, the external evaluator reports will be added. There have to be at least 3. And the DTC's chair and the candidate can add materials up to November 15th. So that takes us to Sunday. We'll add a day to Monday. So by Monday, after Monday, the file's locked. So the DTC chair and the candidate can't add anything further by that time. As I just mentioned, if there's a need to clarify an issue by any of the committees or by the provost, then in those cases, the chair of the committee, whichever one, or the provost, writes to the candidate to seek that information. Necessary always to copy the secretariat on that, so Bonnie, and ensure that you've got that the question laid out, indicate what's required, and then the candidate will supply that additional information. And again, Bonnie's in copy so that all this exchange itself, as well as any new material, gets added to the tenure file. This all becomes part of the tenure file itself that moves through the process with the candidate. And so this is the way new material can get in. Yeah.
I'll just interject that almost all the letters are in and they're up in the repository. So we're just missing a few at this point, and I think most DCCs can start their work.
Okay, super. Thanks, Bunny. Are there any other questions in the chat? I'm just not monitoring it because I have the screen
No,
share going.
no, it's
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Giovanna asked, are 3 external reports required? Can we proceed with only 2? Giovanna, if there are only 2 at this point, it means that I'm still securing the 3rd. So it's too early in the process to move ahead with just 2 reports. It does happen on occasion that come December, the 3rd report is still not there because the external that committed to it has no longer committed to it, but we'll talk if should that happen in December.
Okay, thanks. So the external evaluation letters, which we were just talking about, they're there to evaluate the candidate's research principally. And they are people who were agreed to back in the spring between the chair of the UTC and the candidate, and then the evaluators were then ranked. These are people who can't have been in a conflict of interest and can't be members of the McGill community, and they really should not have had collaborations with the candidate or any affiliation that's an employment in nature with the university in the years prior to the this one, when they're called upon to do the evaluation, and usually the time frame is 6 years. We use that as a rule of thumb. Okay, your responsibilities as a committee are to ensure that you are guided by the principles of objectivity, integrity, impartiality, and fairness, that you make recommendations based solely on the performance of the candidate's academic duties as set out in the tenure dossier, that you submitted a report that gives reasons to support your assessment, and there to include references to external evaluations, and ensure careful abidance by procedure established by the regulations. And I'd said including the deadlines, I'd say especially the deadlines. They really are critical to adhere to. I want to say a few things on this. So it's really tough, I would say, to be a member of a DTC because you're assessing someone in your department, and so when things are strong, then it's usually quite easy. When there are challenges in the file, that can be tough, and DTCs sometimes have a hard time making the call that something is not going well for the candidate. It is crucial that we do our jobs in this regard because it can be, we've seen cases where the DTC recommends tenure, ignores important evidence, and then the UTC is stuck making the tough decision. Conversely, we've seen some cases where the DTC or the UTC does not recommend tenure, and it's not clear why, right? So, and you know, we worry very much about the possibility of extraneous factors weighing in on the tenure process. I would say by and large, the adherence to due process in the tenure process at McGill is impeccable. People really take this seriously. They devote a lot of time and energy to it. They care about it. But where it goes badly are cases where, for example, there are conversations that occur about the character of the candidate, right? So this person is not a good colleague, right? That kind of famous saying. And what does that even mean? If they're not pleasant or helpful or collegial, then it's really tricky to even think about how that could be justified as bearing upon the assessment of the dossier, unless it plays out in things like the person has really not done any service or has not done service well. And so unless there's evidence in the dossier, it cannot be weighed in, or the factor in question cannot be weighed in the assessment of performance. The other thing I would caution against are matters of conflicts of interest. So for example, if a committee member is collaborating with a colleague who's going up for tenure, that's a challenge, right? That needs to be brought to the attention of Bonnie, and we'll talk it through. But there shouldn't be collaborations between the committee members and the candidates. And the last thing I'll say, and I think there's some questions in the chat, are the conversations about the assessments of the file. So those conversations are meant to happen in camera. They're confidential conversations. So the DTC has entire purchase on the assessment for at that level, and UTC at that level. So there shouldn't be exchanges of information with colleagues who aren't part of the DTC about the file. And similarly, colleagues who are on the DTC together or on a UTC together shouldn't be having ex parte conversations about the file outside of the meetings. The meetings are really the only place where discussion and assessment and decision happen. And outside of that, there really should not be any discussion or decision making, because that will taint the process. I want to stress all this because this is really where I think your responsibility becomes so important in the tenure process overall. So I'm going to pause and ask if there are, I think there are some things in the chat, so I'll stop here and take those questions.
So maybe Jen Riley, if you want to ask your question out loud.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Yeah, so maybe I'll just read it verbatim. So given that DTC's responsibility is to evaluate and make recommendations based on what's in the dossier in front of us, is there any mandate or option to address cases where we believe, we may have cause to believe what's in there is misleading or maybe just flat out wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you an example. Someone writes, I played a leadership role in overhauling the curriculum of this particular program through my involvement on the curriculum committee this year. And then someone else who was on the curriculum committee who's on the DTC is like, I was on that committee too, and this person didn't come to a single meeting, so I don't know where they're getting this notion that they led a process or kind of instantiated some sort of major program change. So at that point, the committee then should be, that's a moment where you ask for additional information, the clarifying information. What specifically did you do? Can you indicate the meetings you attended, what specific contributions you made, and what evidence of performance you can point us to that will allow us to see your impact? Does that help you?
It does, thank you.
Okay.
The other question in the chat was regarding templates for CVs. There is a template offered by TLS, however, it's not a mandatory requirement to use that.
Correct. Are there anything else in the chat?
No, that's it.
Okay. Okay. Any questions before I keep going? All right. I can't see you, so I'm just sort of imagining all of you there paying close attention. Okay. So as a DTC, I'm assuming most people here are DTCs. I know some UTC members are not thinking about this just yet because their work starts only in February. But essentially, the goal that you want to be setting for yourself is setting two meetings at least. So please set the meeting, your first meeting soon. Make sure you've got it in the books. You may need a second meeting, you may not. But my advice would be to set your first meeting by late November, early December. Now, in a normal year, an ordinary year, I would say the risk is that after classes end, people start to travel and disperse. That's a very much smaller possibility this year. And given that in the past, the meetings would all happen in person, which is not the case anymore for now, it's easier to meet in some respects. At the same time, if you meet and you find you have gaps in information, you need to give the candidate enough lead time to supply that information. And if you meet as a committee and you decide that you're tending to the negative, the sooner you can tell the candidate that, the better, because you're going to want to set time to let the candidate know, call them to the meeting, give them at least 2 weeks of lead time before they're called to a meeting, because they're going to want to prepare and they're going to need to find an advisor to come with them to the meeting. Most people will come to such meetings with an advisor. And remember that the DTC report, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the DTC's report is due on the 25th of January. So in between all that, there's grading and holidays, etc. So you need the time to prepare a reasoned report. So working backwards from the 25th of January, there needs to be enough time in case you do have a tending to the negative, so that you have enough time for the candidate to be notified of a meeting, hold the meeting, and then you'll probably need time to convene following that meeting to make a final decision. Ensure also that you know who on your committee is writing the final report. And in some cases, not common, but it does happen, there sometimes are non-unanimous committee decisions. So some members of the committee will recommend tenure and some will not. So it is possible to include a minority report. The committee members have to attend the meeting, so ensure that everyone is available and commits to attending the meeting. If a colleague fails to attend one meeting, it means they can't participate in the process any longer. So that's important. So if a colleague has a conflict last minute and they can't come to DTC meeting 1, it means they're no longer permitted to participate in further meetings or in the process of evaluating the candidate. Also, part of the responsibility is, as was mentioned, ensuring that if you need to communicate with the candidate at any point, to do that through the Secretariat. So make sure, please, that Bonnie Bornstein is on copy on all of your messages to the candidate, and the candidates have all been informed that if they need to communicate with members of the committee, or the chairs in particular, that they also copy the Secretariat. The external evaluations are submitted anonymously. You'll know who the writers are, but the candidate won't. And even if the candidate asks to see the letters, which happens when there's attending to the negative meeting. So if a colleague is called to attending to the negative meeting, they get the external evaluator's letters, but they're redacted to preserve their confidentiality. And Bonnie does that, and I look at them to ensure that there's no identifying information there. And then the last thing is that if there's concerns that you have about the file, the candidate absolutely has to be given a full and fair chance to make their case. And that is something that I think is pretty straightforward and obvious to all of us as to why. So I've been asked this year to talk a little bit more about equity in the tenure process and to ensure that we're all mindful of the importance of equity, not only in all the work we do around recruitment and selection for awards, etc., but also in the process for tenure. So with respect to unconscious bias, I think that what I would suggest to you is that it's most cases, based on what I've seen, DTC and UTC colleagues come to the table with a very open mind about assessing fairly. But if you have preconceived ideas or even kind of past experience with the candidate, rather than questions of demography, I would say prior interactions, for better or for worse, what you know about the candidate, that can color your impact, or sorry, your assessment. And so when you come to the assessment of the file, it is important to make sure that you take your time to read carefully all elements of the dossier and not to presume one way or the other anything about the quality of the file. We talk a lot about unconscious bias in the context of academic hiring, or actually all hiring at the university. And we know that it plays out on our subconscious in decision-making of all kind. And it basically is mental shortcuts that, that cause us to default in making choices or decisions one way or the other. And I would say in the tenure process, the factors that lead to those outcomes, they may be on account of issues of gender, race, ability, etc. But I would say it's important also to be mindful of how your past connections and relationships with the candidate may color your assessment or your approach to the file. So when you're looking at the file, just in terms of thinking specifically about equity, please be mindful of the following. So the role and place of leaves and career deceleration. So it is the case for many people, and I would say this is particularly true for parental leave, but also for health-related leaves, that when people come back, they don't necessarily hit the ground running at the same pace as when they took their leave. So there is some time to kind of ramp up again, and that needs to be carefully considered. The question of what counts as valid research sometimes preoccupies people. I would say that by and large, the tenure committees at McGill are very, very cognizant of the different ways in which research has been moving and shaped. We have this document that was created about 3 or 4 years ago now, in collaboration between the Provost Office and MAUT, to look at the different kinds of examples that count as powerful, impactful research in our academic world and community. So of course, the peer-reviewed manuscript remains a kind of gold standard, but there are other things that are equally, or perhaps not equally, but should indeed be recognized and valued as making a contribution. Increasingly, I would say particularly junior colleagues are asking the university to pay attention to what would be called informal or hidden work that tenure candidates take up. And the argument goes that much of this work is undertaken by women colleagues or racialized colleagues. And it takes the form of things like mentoring, coaching, supporting other colleagues and professors, or sorry, other colleagues and students from similar demographic groups. It also takes the form of being consulted on questions. So, and this is particularly the case, and I think this is quite well known in our community, but for example, Indigenous colleagues who are junior are asked all the time to take up, for example, guest lectures in professors and other professors' classes, or consulting on, I want to invite an elder to my class, what's the appropriate way to do this, that kind of thing. And what we are telling colleagues who are junior and entering into the process is to set all that out, right? It's hard to measure and quantify in the same way as working on a committee, but indicate it, right? If you're going above and beyond in ways that are not necessarily as visible because they're not formalized as part of a committee, then explain it. Explain to the committee all that you do, because this is the time for you to put your best possible foot forward. But the committee won't be able to assess that or count it unless they can't presume it, right? So if it's not in the file, it's going to be difficult for a committee to hypothesize about informal work that colleagues have done. So colleagues have been told and instructed, put that in. Make sure that your committee is aware of how much you've done, the impact it's had, and the scope of the contribution you've made in terms of both time and influence. Lastly, read the narrative carefully. So some people are very good at selling themselves, and some people are much less able to do that, and they're going to be more cautious or tentative. And so please be mindful of the facts rather than the glitter. And I think people here who are on committees are sophisticated in that regard, and most people can read through things. But I just wanted to underscore that. Last point, and this is not something that I want to kind of engage in a debate about here and now. In my role as Associate Provost overseeing both academic faculty matters as well as equity, there is an increasing, I would say, level of wariness about course evaluations and whether or not they're biased. And I do believe that there is a potential for bias to shine through in course evaluations, just as there is a potential for bias to emerge in any kind of assessment or evaluation. But I don't think that course evaluations are irrelevant at all. They're the only opportunity for students to have a say in the tenure process, and they demonstrate teaching excellence very often. They can be extremely helpful to professors. We've done a study at McGill a few years back where we looked just at gender. That was the only ability that we had at the time. We did not find bias in the course evaluations at all in terms of gender. What we do say, however, is that it's a problem to use just course evaluations for the teaching portfolio. We don't rely exclusively either on the qualitative or quantitative information there, but instead we look at course evaluations as one piece of the whole. So they may have difficulties in them, but we look at the whole teaching portfolio, and anyone who's been on a tenure committee will know that besides the course evaluation, there are other elements in a file that are going to have an impact as well. And maybe I'll just stop there and see if there are any new questions.
I think we covered the questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions they want to speak out loud?
Okay. Okay, I'll keep going then. Some people have asked us to talk specifically about COVID and its assessment on performance. So of course we have the 1 year extra that people can take with respect to their tenure time, if they feel that COVID had adversely affected their performance. At the moment now, the university admin, so that's primarily me as well as a couple of deans, are working with MAUT to develop measures to help with equitable assessment in the time of COVID. And we're going to be releasing some guidelines in this regard early in the new year. I just wanted to signal, though, that this is a pretty tricky thing, because one thing we don't want to do is sort of weigh adversities against one another. So for some people, they had a really hard time because, for example, they lost activity time in their lab, but for others, they were home with small children for 6 months and they could get nothing done. For others, they were working in a remote area where there was minimal bandwidth and they weren't able to be productive. So what we are saying is that we're going to be giving people a chance to explain the impact of COVID in future tenure applications and reappointment applications, and you'll see more news on that front. For this year, though, for the 2020 cohort, we asked people to apply as usual. So the tenure dossier looks exactly the same. Of course, people still had the option to defer by a year, and some people did take up that option. But for people who submitted in 2020 on September 1st, their tenure dossier, there's nothing different in the file. The file looks the same. But I would ask you, please, that if you have a tending to the negative in the DTC, if that happens, then I would ask you, when you call the person to the meeting, to invite them to submit any information that they would like in a one-page letter explaining whether COVID had an impact on their performance. What we're really concerned about is that people will say, I didn't have a chance to explain it, but I lost some really important lead time on a project I was working on that I was close to completing but not able to because of COVID, and that only comes out after we end up with a tenure denial. So if a committee has attending to the negative meeting this year, then when you call the candidate to that meeting, please invite them to signal to the committee whether any adverse circumstances were impacted, were rather inflicted by the onset of COVID. It may be that there's nothing there, right? That the tenure denial has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that there was a pandemic. But if there was that, they should be given an invitation to explain that so that the committee can consider it to the extent that this is relevant. So here's the kind of process for assessing tenure. So phase 1 starts on the 1st of May of the tenure year and begins with the process of listing the externals, and the chair and the dean agree to the list, and the UTC then ranks it, and by September 1st, the file goes into the Secretary General. And in phase 2, which is where we are now, this is when the committees are meeting at the DTC or library level, and the deadline for submitting new material either by the chair of the committee or by the candidate is the 15th of November. So again, that's going to be on Monday this year because the 15th is on Sunday. And after the 15th, there's no new material that can be added to the tenure dossier unless it's been requested by a committee member to clarify, or by a committee or the provost to clarify something that's missing from the file. On the 25th of November, the external reports go to the DTC, but Bonnie mentioned that most of them are already uploaded, so that's good, and a few more are missing, but those should come in by the 25th. After the fall term, once we get to January, the DTC report will be due, as I mentioned, on the 25th, so it's crucial to respect that deadline. And then the UTC begins its work beginning immediately thereafter. And the UTC follows a similar process to the DTC. Again, they have the ability to ask for clarifying information from the candidate. And the UTC then submits its report by the 30th of April, following which the provost assesses the file and makes a final recommendation, which ultimately is accepted or not by the Board of Governors. Most tenure candidates get tenure. So the tenure success rate at McGill is extremely high. It is well over 90%. And this is because most people who go up for tenure know that they're going to be successful because they've had positive outcomes in their reappointment, and they've also had reinforcement and support from their units at the time of merit every year. If a candidate has had problems, it really shouldn't be a surprise when they get to tenure. So they should have had signals provided to them through conversations with the chair in the years leading up to their tenure. Similar to reappointment. The reappointment should have had warning bells in it at the time, at that time. Again, if there's a tending to the negative, so if the committee is inclined to not recommend tenure, before that decision can be entered, they have to absolutely signal that to the candidate in a written letter. So the letter that goes to the candidate should explain what the concerns are, and that the candidate then gets that letter and is invited to appear before the committee to make their case with an advisor present. And again, be able to provide a written explanation of any adverse effects that they encountered as a result of COVID. In a DTC tending to the negative meeting, the candidate will appear, make their case, and then the committee members have a chance to ask questions. Normally, you want to allot about an hour and a half for that meeting. Probably it's more likely to last an hour. And you're also going to want to make sure that you have time as a committee to meet after the meeting. It doesn't have to be immediately after, but it should be soon after, so that as a group you can decide how you want to go after hearing the candidate make their case. It is not hugely uncommon for people to persuade a committee that was originally tending to the negative to recommend for tenure. So very often these meetings can be crucially important to the candidate to make their case to the committee members, in particular because they have a chance to verbally provide information that the committee members maybe thought was lacking. If tenure is denied, and remember that tenure can only be denied when it's ultimately recommended by or decided by the provost, the colleague will have their appointment at McGill continue for up to a year, and the candidate also has the right to an appeal, which has to be instituted shortly after the tenure refusal is entered. Sorry. So just a last piece of information is to give you information about where you can find further support. So this is all laid out here. You'll get these slides, and you can contact me or Bonnie at any point. If there's something that comes to me that should have gone to Bonnie, we'll connect with each other, and vice versa. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and maybe we can have a discussion for a bit before we wrap up. I'm happy to take any questions, and also any points of clarification. So I'm just looking at the chat. Nigel, yes, we'll distribute the slides. We'll put them online, right, Bonnie?
Yes.
Okay. So Jen, thank you for the course evaluation study. I will look at that. My background is one of the libraries. You probably know which one it is. I'm not sure which one it is. Raj, if there are two candidates evaluated, can they be discussed at one meeting? No. Okay, good question. You don't have to have a separate meeting for every candidate. You can have all your candidates discussed in one meeting. That's no problem. And John, if it's minimum 4+ chair, Bonnie, on this question from John Lydon,
Yes.
do you want to take that one? Because there should be alternate members, no?
There should be alternate members, but should the activity of the DTC or in fact the UTC begin with the member drops out, we can no longer add the alternate member.
Exactly.
The alternate members are there just before the process has begun, that they can be utilized.
So then we proceed with just the 3+ chair at that point?
Yes,
Yeah.
and you would write into the report factually what occurred, that somebody began but then had to leave.
Okay.
So yeah, and that's helpful. So you might also have an even split, a 2-2 on the recommendation. We have seen that before. That's not optimal, but it could happen. And also you don't have to reveal anything here, John, but if someone dropped out, if it's because they really couldn't be part of it, but really when you're a member of a DTC, like opting out really is not an option. Like this is someone's career, right? They should be participating. And as chair, I would kind of, you know, I don't want to sound Sopranos, but you got to put the screws to them. Like this is their job. You got to show up for the meetings and assess.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like if someone got very sick or something.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's obviously different. Yeah.
Yeah, it may happen. Also, to speak to your point, Angela, there's no restriction against having an even number on a committee, although it's a very bad idea.
Yeah. It's very, very rare that there's a split down the middle, but we saw it not that long ago. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'm very happy to give you 37 minutes of your afternoon.
Signatures, okay, so there's, to the best of my knowledge, there's no McGill policy at present that disallows electronic signatures. So we take any kind of signature.
Yeah, I've seen electronic before, especially last spring, because the UTCs all met and finished their submissions after COVID hit. Victoria, if you have a conflict between a candidate and a DTC member, that's a big challenge. It depends on what the conflict is, and I would ask perhaps maybe for maybe Bonnie and you to talk offline, and then Bonnie, if it requires some input from me, we can chat. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So Victoria, maybe offline to connect with Bonnie.
Sure, I'll do that.
Okay. Any last questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, first of all, for being here, but even more importantly, thank you so much for your work on the tenure committees. Tenure is such an important decision. I would say it's even more important than recruitment and hiring. It's crucial work, and it's done so carefully and meticulously at the university. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you for the exceptional work that gets done in this context and for your participation here today. Have a great afternoon and take good care.